At the end of the Great War, Germany was bound by a treaty that annulled almost everything that had made it a power. But under the appearance of a defeated country, a meticulous operation was organized. Engineers, diplomats, and businessmen preserved what remained of their military machinery. In camouflaged factories, cannons were designed. In the Soviet Union, German instructors trained pilots. The Weimar Republic gradually legalized what had been forbidden, using economic stability as an excuse. By the time Hitler came to power, the machinery was already in motion. He only needed to accelerate it. Within a few years, that disarmed nation became a military threat to all of Europe once again. From Krupp's secret contracts to the rockets launched from Peenemünde, everything pursued the same objective. How did a monitored and ruined nation manage to recover its military power without being stopped in time? Deceive to survive, the secret plan. When Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, its armed forces were theoretically dismantled. The infantry was reduced to 100,000 men without heavy artillery. Military aviation was banned, and an Allied commission was established to monitor compliance. But from the very beginning, the German General Staff drew up a plan to evade every clause. The strategy was not to resist openly, but to maintain the appearance of compliance while rebuilding, piece by piece, the machinery of war. That reconstruction would not be visible. It would be carried out quietly, distributed among disguised institutions with unexpected allies and administrative structures designed to deceive. In the months following the signing of the treaty, the German government created agencies whose function was not explicit. A civilian office assumed the production of certain industrial materials, another handled technical oversight of infrastructure, and yet another began researching innovations in aeronautics. None of them used military terms. On the surface, they were entities for economic reconstruction or civil engineering. But in reality, they funneled funds into armaments experiments, stored hidden weapons, or trained personnel under other names. One of the most effective methods was hiding entire factories inside private consortia. Companies that had previously manufactured shells converted their production to civilian goods without changing either their staff or their equipment. The firm that produced Krupp guns began designing agricultural machinery, but in its warehouses the original parts remained. Authorities knew that foreign inspectors would visit certain facilities. For that reason, they created two categories of plants: the visible ones, ready to be examined, and the covert ones camouflaged as spare parts warehouses, repair shops, or technical training centers. Instead of ceasing activity completely, assembly lines were transformed to produce civilian products that could be easily reconverted into war material. A hydraulic tube could serve as a shell body, and a railway car, with slight modifications, could become an artillery platform. Engineers kept blueprints and procedures ready to reactivate military production as soon as they received the order. Transport was another key sector. Under the pretext of keeping the railway infrastructure operational, the Reich reserved special trains to move undeclared military materials. Even in the most closely watched years, locomotives left steel factories with closed wagons labeled technical cargo, which in reality contained aircraft parts or artillery components. Destinations were small depots away from conventional routes, where the material was unloaded and stored by civilian units of the Ministry of Public Works. Meanwhile, personnel training was disguised in technical academies or industrial training centers. Retired officers ran courses on mechanics, explosives, chemistry, or aerial navigation. Students wore neither uniforms nor insignia. To any observer, they were technical trainees. However, the curriculum followed the guidelines of the old Imperial Army. Classes included applied ballistics, coded communications, and rapid deployment maneuvers. In 1920, Berlin established a dual administration structure. On one hand, there existed the visible apparatus of the reduced Reichswehr with its official limitations. On the other, autonomous networks operated, connected to industrial groups, patriotic societies, and veterans associations. These networks acted as logistical, financial, and technical intermediaries to maintain operational continuity. It was not a parallel army, but a camouflaged continuation of the previous one. The German Ministry of Defense deleted any documents that could suggest continuity with the military past. New records were filled with ambiguous terms. Instead of artillery, they spoke of special technical equipment. Instead of combat drills, They used industrial response exercises. This semantic manipulation extended even to exports. Several batches of weapons were declared as drilling tools or heavy machinery parts. Internally, each piece was recorded with an alternative code. A cannon could be registered as a precision pressure instrument and an ammunition depot as a store of compacted elements. Even railway routes were mapped differently for covert transports. Officials knew that if everything was documented under civilian categories, there would be no way to prove a direct violation. Concealment also encompassed aviation. Although Germany was forbidden from developing air forces, multiple programs were maintained under the pretext of fostering scientific research. Gliders, motorless aircraft, were used as practice vehicles, and several private companies offered recreational flight courses. But behind these trainings were former military pilots, teaching combat maneuvers without identifying themselves as state instructors. International contacts played a key role. Germany established links with companies in Sweden, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, countries not subject to Allied inspections. Through industrial cooperation agreements, they managed to send plans, patents, and prototypes abroad. Thus, when mass production resumed, they would not have to start from scratch. Designs were already tested and stored in secure locations. Covert collaboration with the Red Army was also explored. In the years after the Soviet Revolution, discreet contacts were established with commanders of the new regime. Both nations, isolated by Western powers, shared an interest in developing military technology without interference. From 1921, German delegations began visiting bases on Soviet territory to evaluate possible joint training sites. Although this collaboration did not materialize immediately, the first steps were taken during this period. Meanwhile, public opinion in Germany oscillated between resentment and indifference. Many citizens knew efforts were being made to circumvent the treaty but preferred not to ask. Nationalist parties defended rearmament as a way to restore national pride, and moderates tolerated it as a strategic necessity. Allied inspections, though regular, rarely detected serious violations. Inspectors faced altered documents, ambiguous explanations, and a general attitude of formal compliance that concealed a parallel infrastructure. From 1923, the strategy reached greater sophistication. Production was decentralized to avoid suspicious accumulations. One factory produced individual parts, another handled assembly, and a third stored them until an order was received. This made any direct tracking difficult. In the event of an inspection, each plant could claim ignorance about the final use of its production. It was a system designed to compartmentalize responsibilities and reduce the risk of exposure. That same year, authorities promoted the creation of youth technical clubs. There, young people learned principles of physics, mechanical construction, and navigation. Although they appeared to be recreational activities, instructors were selected for their ties to the old military structure. Many future officers of the Third Reich began their training in these circles without their surroundings suspecting. In southern Germany, old production lines were reactivated in small towns where international oversight was less frequent. Several industrial towns, which had been key centers during the Great War, quietly resumed their functions. Chimneys were lit at night, and the noise of machines was masked by other activities. Everything seemed normal, but in reality, a gradual reactivation of the war industry was taking place. By 1924, Germany had built an efficient network of silent rearmament. Without resorting to official statements or facing sanctions, it had recovered much of its technical capacity, maintained trained personnel, and adapted its industry for a potential return to open military production. All of this was achieved without breaking the paper. Each step was taken with deliberate ambiguity, exploiting legal loopholes and the inertia of the Allies. The machinery remained there, latent, waiting for the moment to be reactivated. Diplomatic rearmament, the Stresemann method. Just appointed as head of government, Stresemann quickly went to Deberitz to meet with the army commanders. At that time, he considered the armed forces the only stable element within the country. General Hans von Seeckt, with a rigid face and unflappable expression, was the top authority of the army. He had been the architect of this new military structure and continued to guard it cautiously. He received the newly appointed chancellor with formal words to which Stresemann responded skillfully. Seeckt had previously described him as a skilled politician, though without any intention of getting too close. That initial distance soon turned into open opposition. This friction had deep roots. It reflected the persistent rivalry between the military and the civilian sector, as well as personal differences. Siecht believed that diplomats did not understand the true role of the army and that their actions could harm the armed forces. He feared that a wrong gesture could complicate the situation. On more than one occasion, he opposed the idea of involving the foreign ministry in strategic decisions. However, Stresemann knew that to make progress he needed to build bridges with all sectors. He therefore decided to invite the general to confidential talks, although the meetings did not soften positions. On one occasion, Siecht abruptly left a meeting with the Chancellor after a disagreement on military matters. Despite the tensions, both knew they needed some coordination. Abroad, the powers watched closely. France maintained control over certain areas of Western Germany, and there was a climate of mutual suspicion. Inspections remained active, seeking to verify that Germany complied with the restrictions imposed after the war. In this context, Stresemann focused on achieving agreements that would gradually normalize the situation. The first step was to restore relations with other nations. He promoted a policy that combined diplomacy with caution, avoiding unnecessary provocations. He also tried to project an image of cooperation to the Allies. He proposed participating in multilateral conferences and accepted certain limitations as a gesture of goodwill. At the same time, he sought to gradually modify the imposed conditions. Over time, he managed to have some inspections cancelled. This did not happen immediately, but his persistence took effect. The diplomatic pressures he exerted led to a gradual relaxation. The Control Commission, responsible for monitoring disarmament compliance, began to reduce its presence. Little by little, that surveillance machinery was deactivated. Stresemann also knew how to take advantage of the international context. The fear of Bolshevism's advance generated a new dynamic. Some Western governments began to see Germany as a useful counterbalance. That perception facilitated certain negotiations. In parallel, the German government avoided open clashes with the powers, maintaining a cautious discourse. In this balancing act, he managed to have proposals accepted that would previously have been rejected. He did not do it alone. He had collaborators who understood the importance of combining conciliatory gestures with clear objectives. Each step was measured, avoiding abrupt movements. The agreements signed were used as platforms to advance new requests. In 1925, the Locarno talks marked a key moment. Germany agreed to recognize its western borders, which brought relief to its neighbors. In return, it received an invitation to join the League of Nations. This symbolically powerful gesture allowed it to gain presence on the international stage. That same year, Siecht left his position. Internal tensions and changes in the political landscape pushed him into retirement. His departure was not a triumph for Stresemann, but it did facilitate greater flexibility in strategic decisions. With a new generation of officers, the dialogue between government and army was less tense. Meanwhile, the Treaty of Versailles continued to limit Germany's military capabilities. Nevertheless, with the reduction of external controls, new opportunities arose to reorganize certain structures. The process was neither immediate nor massive, but it allowed previously blocked areas to be gradually reactivated. This dynamic marked a new phase in indirect rearmament. As the years went by, Stresemann's figure consolidated. His interventions in international forums were closely followed. He knew when to speak, what tone to use, and how to manage timing. This skill was key to achieving concessions without raising alarm. It was not about abruptly evading controls, but about eroding them step by step. In 1926, Germany officially joined the League of Nations. It was a milestone. In the eyes of the world, it symbolized the reintegration of a previously marginalized country. Internally, it offered a platform to raise new demands. The government did not waste this opportunity. From this position, it began pressuring to modify treaty clauses. The strategy was clear. Specific objections were raised. The principle of fairness was invoked, and willingness to dialogue was shown. The aim was to gradually dismantle the post-war framework. This was not done through direct confrontation, but through legal mechanisms. This approach proved more effective and politically less costly. Some powers, like Great Britain, showed a certain understanding. They did not want to see a humiliated Germany, fearing it could generate instability. This perception was skillfully used by the German negotiators. Each advance was presented as a step toward lasting peace. This rhetoric worked in multiple scenarios. Meanwhile, ties with other countries were strengthened. Bilateral agreements were signed, communication channels opened, and collaboration networks built. These moves helped to ease resistance. Each diplomatic gesture was part of a larger sequence. Everything was designed to weaken existing restrictions. By 1928, the situation was different from previous years. The international environment showed less rigidity. Conferences served as spaces to negotiate adjustments. Germany began to regain some autonomy without formally breaking with what had been agreed. This evolution was not accidental. It was the result of meticulous planning. Stresemann remained at the helm of foreign policy. Despite internal criticism, he maintained the course. He knew that any misstep could reverse what had been achieved. Therefore, he avoided ostentatious actions and preferred quiet advances. This was the source of his effectiveness. Each treaty modification was a carefully worked achievement. In his final years, his health declined. Nevertheless, he continued to lead negotiations. Until his death in 1929, he was the visible face of a strategy that had transformed Germany's international position. Under his leadership, much of the monitoring apparatus was dismantled without causing formal ruptures. This phase marked a turning point. Diplomacy had been used as a tool to reverse limitations. Treaties, rather than being fixed obstacles, became moldable instruments. This logic would guide many decisions in the following years. Stresemann did not live to see the consequences, but his method left a lasting mark. Armed athletes, the camouflage of the German army. Between 1930 and 1933, the German military leadership secretly intensified its rearmament plans, while inertia prevailed in the West. During those years, the High Command firmly maintained its protest against the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles. The officers argued that it was not only a technical disagreement, but a matter of national dignity. The directives of the Ministry of Defense revolved around keeping all possible means active to ensure a future expansion of the army. The General Staff operated under the premise that armament parity should be achieved at the right moment, not earlier. The fundamental ideas focused on keeping the mobilization capacity alive without openly revealing the preparations. The evasion methods were consolidated on two levels. The first consisted of avoiding foreign inspections through administrative subterfuge, hiding records, and covertly diverting resources. The second involved the use of civilian associations with a sporting character as a cover for military training. These entities, presented as shooting or gymnastics clubs, functioned as platforms for paramilitary instruction without drawing attention. The Ministry of the Interior indirectly collaborated by regulating them ambiguously, allowing the Reichswehr to be involved without officially committing. During that period, the relationship between the military leadership and the socialist sectors became even more strained. The army accused the left wing of obstructing its operational needs, while the Social Democrats viewed any rearmament attempt with suspicion. Debates in Parliament reflected mutual distrust. The Reichswehr maneuvered carefully to maintain political influence without triggering an open conflict with the government. The strategy was to project an image of institutional obedience, but with enough leeway to continue strengthening its internal apparatus. Meanwhile, the deeper layers of mobilization planning continued to develop. Technical teams and strategists created scenarios for future wars, considering logistical capacity, troop transportation, and resource distribution. Each exercise was carried out in strict confidentiality, with classified documents circulated only among a small circle. Despite international surveillance, the Reichswehr advanced in structuring a comprehensive war system. This multi-layered plan considered everything from communications to the supply chain, all without revealing itself. At the same time, Chancellor Brüning faced both economic and political challenges. From his perspective, rearmament should be neither abrupt nor provocative. Rather, it should follow a controlled pace that did not destabilize the country's external image. To this end, he proposed adjusting budgets and aligning military objectives with parameters acceptable to foreign powers. However, disagreements between his administration and the high military command were constant. While he sought to preserve international negotiation, the generals prioritized the restoration of a real offensive force. The disarmament conference proposed by the Western powers sparked discussions within the German apparatus. The key issue was which position to adopt. Some sectors defended a hardline stance, rejecting any additional limitations. Others suggested tactical participation to buy time and study the intentions of other countries. In any case, the evasion tactic was not interrupted. On the contrary, the diplomatic framework was used as a shield to continue expanding clandestine capabilities. The cost of rearmament was another point of friction. Internal reports revealed that the growing expenditure threatened to exceed available resources. The Ministry of Finance warned of fiscal repercussions, while military leaders pressed for more funds. Parallel budgets and opaque financing mechanisms were devised. Some items were disguised under civilian concepts, allowing money to be channeled into reserved projects without raising suspicion. Accounting engineering was key to sustaining military growth without provoking immediate reactions abroad. Another essential aspect was the development of sports activities with military content. Under the name Wehrsport, physical training events were organized that in reality served as pretexts for combat practice. These activities were promoted by associations sympathetic to nationalism, which enjoyed tacit state support. The boundary between civilian and military spheres was deliberately blurred. In these spaces, youth cadres were trained who could later be integrated into more formal army structures. Organizations known as Wehrverbände also played an important role. These groups, operating with a patriotic aesthetic, functioned as strategic reserves. Their existence was tolerated by authorities as long as they did not compromise the internal political balance. Through them, the Reichswehr secured an additional source of trained personnel. Thus, rearmament advanced not only within the barracks, but also in multiple areas of civilian life. Amid these dynamics, the Brüning government came to an end. Its fall was due to multiple factors, including pressure from conservative groups and the army's own impatience. The Chancellor's departure left a vacuum that military leaders were able to exploit. With fewer political obstacles, they could accelerate their plans without constantly negotiating with a hostile civilian power. The path toward a more aggressive restructuring of the armed forces was thus much clearer. Meanwhile, in France and the United Kingdom, signs of German rearmament began to be detected. Intelligence services and diplomats reported suspicious activities. Nevertheless, reactions were tepid. In London and Paris, a mixture of disbelief and passivity prevailed. Some reports warned of the risk of a German military resurgence but were downplayed or ignored. Domestic political priorities and the fear of new tensions limited any effective action. The name of General von Seeckt continued to be mentioned with concern. Although no longer in office, his legacy influenced the foreign perception of the German army. His organizational model and strategic vision were still considered valid. In British circles, Seeckt's figure was associated with meticulous and silent rearmament, which fueled suspicions about the current movements of the Reichswehr. However, the lack of conclusive evidence prevented a clear response. The British analysis of the situation was colored by a mix of hopes and fears. On the one hand, there was confidence that the economic crisis would keep Germany in check. On the other hand, there was fear that any external pressure could trigger an even stronger nationalist reaction. This ambivalence led to an ambiguous foreign policy, combining gestures of cooperation with gestures of warning. In France, by contrast, the concern was more direct. The priority was to reach an agreement with London to establish a common stance on German rearmament. Bilateral talks, however, progressed slowly. The British government avoided committing to alliances that could drag it into a new continental conflict. At the same time, the UK's military balance was in decline. Defence budgets were increasingly limited, and the armed forces suffered systematic reductions. This structural weakness influenced decision-making, making any decisive action against Berlin more difficult. In spiritual terms, there was also talk of a disarmament at the heart of England. Political discourse pointed toward a culture of conciliation and renunciation of confrontation. This atmosphere encouraged passivity in the face of emerging challenges. Meanwhile, the British economy was going through a difficult period. The recession affected the state's capacity to sustain large-scale military projects. Priorities lay elsewhere. Within the British Treasury, there was discussion about whether it was viable to plan in warlike terms. Some officials proposed assessing risks from a fiscal perspective, while others advocated maintaining a low profile internationally. This tension translated into a lack of clear strategy toward Germany. In that vacuum, Berlin found room to continue its rise without facing direct opposition. Thus, between 1930 and 1933, German rearmament consolidated on multiple fronts, while the West watched in silence. The decisions made during those years laid the foundations for what was to come, and what was coming no one could stop. Hitler unleashed, the birth of the Wehrmacht. As soon as the new government consolidated its power, it transformed concealment into official doctrine. The old evasion system, which had avoided inspections for years, was replaced by total legalization. The plans were already prepared. A single order was enough for the army to emerge from the shadows. Under Hitler's command, the transition was immediate, and the limitations of the treaty ceased to have real effect, although respect for foreign powers was still feigned. The first step was to preserve the accumulated experience and infrastructure. The facilities created during the years of secret rearmament were not dismantled. On the contrary, they were expanded. Camouflaged factories were allowed to operate openly. Companies linked to armaments, previously concealed through shell companies or simulated international agreements, began working without hiding. Many resumed contracts with the state that had been cancelled with the fall of the monarchy, and others emerged with new functions adapted to the political context. Key personnel were also retained. Officers who had operated in the shadows were promoted. Those familiar with evasion methods became instructors within the new Wehrmacht. Units that had previously trained under false names or in foreign countries, such as the USSR, returned to Germany. Secret aviation, operating under civilian cover or from Soviet bases, was reorganized under visible command, although not yet officially declared as a military air force. The next move was to establish a national legal basis to support the regime's actions. Decrees were passed invalidating treaty restrictions within German territory. Official doctrine declared that Germany had the right to defend itself like any other nation. This narrative was adopted by all state-controlled media. Domestic propaganda insisted that rearmament was a necessity for survival, not a provocation. Meanwhile, German diplomatic representatives denied any treaty violations at international meetings. In parallel, a coordinated campaign began to expand the number of soldiers. The personnel limits imposed by the treaty were exceeded openly. The army grew from 100,000 to several hundred thousand in a short time. Military academies were reopened and new facilities were built in various regions. Accelerated training courses multiplied and training time was reduced to incorporate more recruits. The administrative structure was also reformed. Technical ministries were created to coordinate armament growth. Former dispersed departments operating in secret were integrated into centralized bodies under direct supervision of the new executive power. Weapons production, training, logistics, and strategy ceased to be separate compartments and began to coordinate according to an overall plan supervised by the High Command. At the same time, technological programs that had begun clandestinely were resumed and refined. Aviation received priority. Resources were invested in developing new models and training pilots. Devices that had until then been built for civilian use or export were redesigned for military capacity. The aviation industry was strengthened, runways expanded, and test centers with restricted access were established. Heavy artillery, for its part, became one of the most tightly controlled areas. Previous designs that had been discarded for fear of sanctions were revived and new prototypes were commissioned. Cooperation between the state and manufacturers allowed delivery deadlines to be accelerated. Technical reports were stored in special offices and circulated only within a closed circuit. Every cannon, tank, or communication system was considered part of a larger mechanism that had to fit into the overall scheme of military preparation. Another aspect was the restoration of discipline within the troops. A strict set of regulations was imposed, governing everything from personal appearance to schedules. Minor offenses were punished with severe sanctions. The goal was to prevent any sign of disorder or laxity that could weaken the image of strength. Absolute obedience was demanded in every barracks. Military ceremonies multiplied, and the uniform once again occupied a central place in public life. Youth organizations played an essential role in the process. From an early age, children and adolescents were trained in physical exercises, basic weapons training, and strategic concepts. These groups acted as a nursery for the regular army. Their activities were supervised by instructors from the former Reichswehr and followed a detailed plan. Those who excelled were offered direct access to higher military training. Relations with other powers during this period were handled with a mix of evasions and ambiguous statements. Germany responded to accusations with technical documents or carefully drafted diplomatic notes. The existence of treaty violations was denied, while figures or internal legal provisions were presented. Observer visits followed pre-established routes, and the true capabilities remained out of reach. In 1935, the decisive step was taken. The reinstatement of compulsory military service was publicly announced. This was no longer a covert expansion nor defensive measures justified as exceptional. The decision was presented as irreversible. In the same announcement, it was revealed that the new armed force would be called the Wehrmacht, officially replacing the Reichswehr. The move surprised the European powers but did not provoke an immediate response. Shortly thereafter, the existence of the Luftwaffe was made official. This air force, which had operated for years under civilian structures or abroad, was declared an autonomous branch. Its commanders, combat capabilities, and role within the national doctrine were presented. The air fleet grew rapidly. The aircraft secretly manufactured during the previous decade were adapted and put into service. New pilots were trained every week. Naval rearmament also advanced. Shipyards were reactivated, and models exceeding the agreed tonnage limits were designed. Tests were carried out in protected facilities, with limited access even within the army. The fleet began incorporating destroyers and submarines with extended range. The development of these elements was justified as part of a defensive maritime strategy, but internal records indicated an expansion for operational purposes. The breach of the Treaty of Versailles was a slow and calculated process. In Berlin, every step was studied before acting, measuring the reactions of London and Paris. Responses never went beyond simple statements. That mildness was enough to confirm that the ground was clear. Since then, the machinery of the new army stopped hiding and advanced unchecked. Hitler used every step as internal validation. Propaganda presented these achievements as symbols of a recovered nation. Images of soldiers marching through Berlin, of fighters flying over mass gatherings, of factories operating day and night were spread across all media. The official narrative spoke of unity, strength, and destiny. In reality, it was a huge logistical operation replacing a limited army with a modern military structure designed for conflict. The international community, limited to formal protests, allowed the regime to act without resistance. Within 3 years, Germany had turned concealment into law and shadow into official structure. Every document, budget, and weapon was now integrated into the machinery of an expanding army. By 1936, the change was irreversible. The Reich's army no longer had any relation to the limited structure imposed in 1919. Treaties were still mentioned, but only as historical reference. German military institutions operated at full capacity. Slow and fragmented international diplomacy could not reverse the process. What had been planned in the shadows for years now set the pace of a country prepared for war. The engine of the Reich, Krupp, and the war economy. In 1936, the Ruhr plants were activated with an intensity not seen since the days of the Great War. Alfred Krupp personally oversaw every contract, every delivery, every prototype. In addition, he would make unannounced visits to the metallurgical laboratories of the main Essen complex, where new hardness levels were being tested. Instructions were given orally, and deliveries were timed precisely. The company took on new commitments to the regime, reinforcing ties that had been woven for years. Speer's visits became increasingly frequent, while technicians accelerated tests and assemblies. The assembly lines produced continuously, including long-range artillery, special ammunition, and armor parts. Administrative offices kept detailed records of every ton of steel, every minute of production, and every hired worker. Hidden workshops in Essen doubled their workforce, although official records spoke only of simple civilian expansions. In reality, under discreet roofs, components for the new Panzer III were being assembled, with alloys treated using undisclosed chemical processes. Blueprints circulated in sealed envelopes, signed by personnel with direct authorization from Berlin. At the same time, Adam Tooze documented how Göring's 4-year plan had driven resource allocation. From 1936, the Reich's figures reflected a complete shift toward a war economy. Steel production doubled in 3 years, and coal supplied furnaces that did not stop even at night. Export quotas were reduced to a minimum, while the Ministry of Economics approved subsidies for key refineries. Internal accounts deliberately omitted expenditures for factories under military control. Between 1936 and 1938, coordination between the Ministry of Armaments departments and Krupp facilities was total. Requests came through internal channels coded, indicating exact quantities, intended use, and delivery dates. Engineers spent entire workdays redesigning old models. Tests were conducted under simulated combat conditions. If any part failed, the report was sent directly to Berlin, bypassing the general management. Meanwhile, data collected by TUS confirmed that from that year onward, defense spending already exceeded 20% of GDP. Internal Reich charts showed forced growth in key sectors, mainly land armaments, aviation, and railway logistics. Taxes on consumer goods rose in parallel to finance this pace. Rations of some foods were discreetly reduced, especially in working-class areas, although propaganda presented it as a productive adjustment. In 1937, the Magdeburg plant received instructions to modify its line and manufacture parts for multiple launchers. There was no official record. Technicians were selected for loyalty, not merit. Documents signed by Alfred used neutral language without military references. At the same time, Alfred himself visited other supplier plants, ensuring all deliveries were synchronized. No delay was acceptable, and any deviation was penalized. In the same year, the Reich's economic reports showed controlled budget deviations. Although the deficit was evident, the projections justified the spending pace. Domestic loans grew backed by secret bonds, which did not appear in any public accounting. Some technical universities were intervened to collaborate directly with armament development, although they maintained a facade of civilian research. Several professors came to depend on the Central Planning Office. In Krupp's offices, engineers developed faster reloading mechanisms. The tests were sent directly to the High Command. No improvement went unused. Efficiency was key, and every prototype had to pass the tests flawlessly. In the smaller factories subordinated to Essen, double shifts were multiplied. Workers received in-kind bonuses, often through vouchers that could only be used within the consortium's closed system. In 1938, Alfred completely restructured the supply chain. Contracts with smaller steel mills were cancelled and replaced by direct agreements with state-controlled suppliers. Confidentiality clauses were absolute. Deliveries were made at night under armed supervision. In some cases, transports used secondary routes to avoid tax control. The actual production figures circulated only among 3 people: Alfred, his technical director, and a liaison from the ministry. During the same year, central bank reserves were redirected to specific rearmament projects. Gold was transferred in internal operations that left no visible traces. Some buildings were expropriated to install auxiliary workshops. Insurers participated with special policies that excluded sabotage damage. No factory could stop without direct authorization. If there was a shortage of supplies, the ministry intervened to reallocate stock from other sectors. By 1939, the machinery was at its peak. Tank, artillery, and ammunition production exceeded all previous records. Factories operated at full capacity, and the margin for error was 0. Alfred maintained daily control through coded reports. Workers were no longer mere laborers, but part of a strategic chain. The company had merged with the state into a network without visible separation. Every soldier who would receive a piece built at Krupp was at that moment a cog in something much larger. Prototypes of the end, the engineering of terror. As the fronts spread across Europe, a network of hidden facilities was taking shape within the Third Reich. They were not simple factories, but testing, engineering, and assembly centers, where the regime's most advanced efforts for technological superiority were concentrated. The goal was not to build conventional weapons, but devices capable of altering the course of the conflict through technical wonder or unprecedented devastation. Underground, in facilities shielded by kilometers of rock, production of the first cruise missiles in history began. The V-1, known as flying bombs, required no pilot and could be launched from fixed platforms or mobile ramps. Their design was simple but effective: a compact fuselage with short wings, a high-explosive warhead, and a pulse jet engine. Once activated, they flew in a straight line until the fuel ran out, then they descended violently. They were not precise, but they spread terror with their unmistakable sound and random impacts on urban areas. The first units were launched at London in 1944, but their development had begun years earlier inside camouflaged hangars in northern Germany. At the same time, another device gained priority: the V-2 rocket, much more advanced than its predecessor. Designed to reach supersonic speeds and ballistic trajectories, it could rise to more than 80 kilometers before descending vertically on its target. Unlike the V-1, it was impossible to detect or intercept in the air. Its impact came with no warning, only a sudden explosion. The program was led by a team assembled by the Wehrmacht in collaboration with civilian engineers and SS personnel. Among them were some of the names most associated with the future space race, although at that time they focused on multiplying the Reich's destructive potential. The main development center was Peenemünde, a remote base on the Baltic Sea, where test benches, launch platforms, and instrumentation tunnels were built. To hide the volume of personnel and infrastructure involved, systematic forced labor was employed. Thousands of prisoners were transferred from concentration camps to underground factories where they assembled parts under extreme conditions. One of the most notorious complexes was Mittelwerk, excavated inside a mountain and operated directly by the SS. There, in endless shifts, inmates handled explosive components without protection or rest. The mortality rate was as high as the production pace. Each V-2 built represented dozens of deaths from exhaustion, accidents, or summary executions. Production figures increased as operational deployment approached, while internal reports discussed mechanical performance and logistical efficiency without mentioning the human cost. On the surface, official propaganda announced that a new weapon would change the course of the war. No details were offered, but rumors spread of a projectile capable of annihilating entire cities. This narrative did not stray far from certain real plans, such as the development of the Dora cannon, a railway artillery piece with a caliber of more than 80 centimeters, capable of firing 7-ton projectiles. Its deployment required days of preparation, multiple logistics trains, and thousands of workers, but once ready, it could destroy fortifications at 20 kilometers distance. It was used in the siege of Sevastopol, where it pulverized underground structures built with reinforced concrete. Other initiatives never saw combat operation, although they were developed to advanced stages. One of them was the Rheintochter missile, conceived as an anti-aircraft defense with multi-stage design and automatic guidance. Acoustic and thermal weapon models were also designed, whose principle was to emit pressure waves or intense heat to incapacitate enemy units without direct physical contact. In several cases, the experiments failed to produce practical results, but they absorbed considerable resources and were kept under the strictest secrecy. In parallel, tests were carried out with hybrid aircraft and gliders equipped with rocket engines, which were intended to reach altitudes higher than those available to conventional aviation. The objective was to avoid radar detection and attack from the stratosphere. Some tests included models with pressurized cockpits and ejection seats. Most crashed during test flights, but their records were preserved as a basis for future developments. In the same period, designs with circular rotors were proposed, like the Flettner helicopters, which served as reconnaissance platforms or for limited transport on secondary fronts. Guidance systems represented another key challenge. For the V-2, stabilizing gyroscopes and altitude sensors were adopted, connected to an analog computer capable of calculating trajectories with minimal margins of error. This assembly allowed targets more than 300 kilometers away to be reached with a deviation acceptable for strategic purposes. German scientists even studied radio frequency systems to modify the missile's course in flight, although these devices did not become standardized. In the case of the V-1, the mechanical timer dictated the flight duration, which meant each launch depended on the exact calculation of the moment of fuel cutoff. The testing environment included a network of tunnels, hangars, and laboratories where the data from each trial were recorded. Any deviation was documented precisely and forwarded to the technical offices. There, engineers adjusted parameters and proposed variants that were tested on subsequent days. The sequence could be repeated dozens of times before a design was accepted as valid. When a model was approved, manufacturing orders were issued to the industrial centers under SS control. Each assembly line operated with military discipline, reporting directly to the party hierarchy. Meanwhile, abroad, Allied intelligence services began to receive reports about the existence of these weapons. Spies infiltrated into Norway, the Netherlands, and France transmitted fragmentary data about launch ramps, cargo movements, and anomalous explosions. In response, reconnaissance flights were organized that confirmed the construction of camouflaged installations in wooded areas. One of the major discoveries was the Esoteric base in northern France, designed as a starting point for massive attacks on the United Kingdom. Its concrete structure was more than 5 meters thick and was equipped with railway tunnels, fuel depots, and control rooms. In 1943, while testing of the V2 program continued, some of the most sensitive facilities were already operating from fortified locations. Under artificial hills or within natural rock formations, structures were established with restricted access, autonomous ventilation, and constant surveillance. Entry was through narrow passages, where each section was controlled by armed personnel. Inside, without natural light, components were welded, ignition circuits assembled, and propulsion mechanisms tested. The entire process proceeded at a steady pace under direct supervision of the Reich's technical apparatus. At the same time, other secret fronts were taking shape outside Europe. From Latin America to the Pacific, German agents infiltrated industrial, logistical, and academic networks to gather information or sabotage supplies. According to documents collected by later researchers, there were specific missions focused on studying radioactive materials, radar equipment, and camouflage methods. In Panama, the Nazis attempted to gain indirect access to the canal through trade agreements with neutral companies. At U.S. universities, they recruited sympathetic students or faculty with strategic contacts. Each operation followed a compartmentalized chain where participants were unaware of the ultimate purpose. Among the most ambitious projects was the possibility of developing a fusion device. Although Germany lacked the necessary infrastructure to achieve this goal in the short term, there were initial plans to gather materials and theories in collaboration with foreign scientists. Chemical compounds and metal alloys that could act as initiators of chain reactions were explored without conclusive results. In parallel, biological toxins and chemical agents were investigated for offensive purposes. Some prototypes were stored in remote facilities under the direct supervision of the Nazi security apparatus. At several points, the regime's leadership reviewed proposals to manufacture intercontinental rockets. The most well-known was the A9/A10 project, conceived to reach the U.S. East Coast from platforms located in Western Europe. Although it never progressed beyond the design and partial testing phase, it involved the construction of aerodynamic models and propulsion tests that were later reused by other space programs in subsequent decades. In 1943, as the war began to turn in favor of the Allies, the Third Reich's technological gamble reached its peak. It was no longer about anticipating the future, but trying to avoid defeat through a miracle solution. The result was an accumulation of unfinished projects, weapons that were never deployed, and laboratories that ended up evacuated or destroyed. The Esoteric Reich, weapons from beyond. As the Eastern Front collapsed and Allied troops advanced in the West, several German departments turned to initiatives that defied all conventional frameworks. It was not about mass production or improving already used prototypes, but about exploring paths that bordered on the irrational. In the spring of 1943, the High Command gave the green light to a series of investigations that had until then been discarded due to technical infeasibility or strategic risk. The first of these developments was based on the so-called Project Glock, a metal structure buried underground whose rotating core contained an unknown liquid compound. The forced rotational movement generated high-intensity electromagnetic pulses. No document confirmed its ultimate purpose, but the files suggested that the goal was to alter gravitational fields in controlled environments. The project was led by a small group under the supervision of the SS. Their technicians operated in facilities without visible identification and followed rules different from the rest of the military apparatus. Among the names linked to these tests was an engineer with a background in the aerospace industry, recruited directly from Peenemünde. Several operators died during the initial phases for unspecified reasons. Later reports mentioned cellular alterations and disorientation after exposure to the generated field. The tunnel locations were evacuated in 1945 without leaving traces, and the files were removed by special units of the Reich Main Security Office. At the same time, a less documented front was taking shape in the Bavarian Alps. There, structures were tested designed to concentrate solar radiation for destructive purposes. This plan was called the Sonnengewehr and consisted of a large parabolic mirror theoretically capable of generating a thermal column visible from the stratosphere. The engineering required far exceeded the manufacturing capacity of the time, but reduced models were built for validation purposes. In certain tests, metal sheets placed in a straight line reflected the concentrated beam toward a specific point, allowing targets to be heated from a distance. Technical reports warned about the instability of the system under adverse atmospheric conditions. Further north, in a late offshoot of the A4 project, a fixed long-range weapon was designed based on a rifled gun with multiple lateral progressive ignition chambers. This new device, named V3, used a system of sequential pulses to accelerate the projectile within an extended barrel. Unlike the V1 and V2, it did not rely on autonomous flight systems nor require mobile launch. It was built in a static position with a battery aimed at the English Channel from the facilities excavated in Mimoyecas, northern France. Initial tests showed the ability to exceed 160 kilometers of range, although with significant margins of error. The site, partially destroyed before operational deployment, was inspected by Allied technicians at the end of the conflict, and several of its components were transferred to laboratories in London for later analysis. Simultaneously, the Reich channeled resources into unconventional projects. One of the most disturbing was directed by a cell protected by Himmler, operating on the southern border of the Third Reich. At this center, tests with high-frequency acoustic fields were conducted. The aim was to build emitters that, when activated, generated sound waves capable of destabilizing bone structures in living beings. The retained documents included plans for devices mounted on mobile platforms. Some experiments demonstrated that amplifying certain frequencies caused convulsions in small mammals at controlled distances. Development did not progress beyond the laboratory stage due to the difficulty of applying the technique in combat environments. In 1944, the Red Army Counterintelligence Service intercepted graphic materials from the Silesia sector. They showed diagrams of large floating spheres suspended by concentric rings. Initial analyses could not determine their functionality, although margin notes mentioned reversed axial movement. The Soviet unit in charge seized the material and sent it to the Technical Analysis Center in Moscow. The authors of the plans were never identified, and their origin was lost after the fall of Berlin. Some of these sketches resurfaced decades later in privately expropriated archives in Poland. From the west, British services located a facility containing closed silos with armored doors and thermal sensors. Inside were cylindrical capsules of an unknown metal whose chemical composition did not match usual patterns. Examination by British experts revealed they contained compounds with reflective properties and high density. None of the records mentioned their intended use, although one document referred to an experimental aerial dispersion phase. Investigators could not determine whether they were weapons, containers, or transport prototypes. All material was transferred to secure laboratories under direct supervision from London. Meanwhile, US intelligence detected a series of operations around dismantled civilian infrastructures. In Bavaria, a series of ancient tunnels had been retrofitted with high-voltage magnetic field generators. The purpose of these modifications was not clearly documented, but among the confiscated equipment were induction coils, insulating tubes, and wave amplifiers. One of the researchers on site suggested experiments on wireless energy transmission were underway. Although no official confirmation existed, records collected in the area mentioned coordinated tests during nighttime hours. The infrastructure was completely dismantled during the summer of 1945. Legacy in the shadows, what survived. At the end of the war, the structures of the regime did not collapse immediately. The administrative machinery remained active as the Allied forces advanced. In the last months, the German economy operated in a fragmented manner, with areas under local control and decisions made without central coordination. The railway system was collapsed, and factories were disconnected from their logistical network. Despite the chaos, certain industrial sectors continued operating by inertia, fueled by hidden reserves or autonomous supply circuits. In this context, numerous technical documents, plans, models, and prototypes were deliberately hidden. Some were buried in mines, others stored in underground facilities. The priority of the command was to prevent sensitive information from falling into Soviet hands. Several research centers were partially dismantled, moving key components to the south of the country. Some scientists were ordered to remain hidden until receiving instructions. Others voluntarily surrendered to the US authorities in hopes of securing personal protection. In parallel, intelligence operations were accelerated to identify and capture technical and scientific personnel of strategic value. The United States compiled classified lists with names associated with ballistic, nuclear, and aerodynamic projects. Specialized teams roamed the occupied areas, interrogating former heads of factories, universities, and technical units. Documents captured in Berlin revealed networks of scientists who had worked on advanced weapons. Some names were already known, while others appeared for the first time in the seized archives. Meanwhile, the Soviets deployed entire brigades dedicated to extracting machinery, engineers, and complete technologies. From industrial facilities in Silesia to laboratories in the Leipzig area, direct orders for dismantling and transfer to Soviet territory were executed. Entire convoys left loaded with military equipment, turbines, and electronic components. Some German technicians were deported along with their families under informal agreements or threats of retaliation. Others were integrated into state programs with monitored accommodation. In the Western Zone, the Americans launched the operation known as Paperclip. The directive allowed recruiting scientists from the former regime, even if they had party ties. The goal was to prevent their knowledge from being used by Moscow. Under new names and edited profiles, many were discreetly moved to US military bases. They were assigned projects related to rocket development, supersonic aviation, and guidance systems. Some held high-level positions in federal research centers in the following years. Simultaneously, the British organized their own interrogation network. Former military facilities were used to isolate German experts and extract technical information through continuous interviews. Some of the interrogated had been part of the original Peenemünde team. Others had collaborated in sectors such as liquid propulsion, encrypted telecommunications, or aerial detection. The data obtained fed secret technical reports used by the Air Ministry and the British War Department. Although many of the scientists were not formally integrated into projects, their knowledge influenced subsequent defense decisions. Meanwhile, the German economy was facing a complete collapse. The currency had no real value, domestic trade was minimal, and bartering prevailed. The occupation authorities initiated audits to determine what resources were still available. Factories that had not been bombed were inspected, and many of them were directly managed by the Allies. Technical inventories were organized, processes were documented, and intervention protocols were initiated for equipment that could be reused. Between 1945 and 1946, an industrial reorganization program under foreign control was implemented. During this process, available technologies were classified according to their strategic value, transferability, or need for elimination. Some mechanical and electronic devices were sent to evaluation centers. Others were dismantled by direct order, while some prototypes became part of reserved studies. Areas of greatest interest included specialized metallurgy, precision optical systems, and advanced combustion processes. In parallel, reports began circulating about projects that did not appear in official records. Several documents preserved in the personal offices of regime officials mentioned initiatives at an early stage that were never fully implemented. Some focused on non-traditional energy applications, others on infrastructure buried in mountainous areas. These scattered and fragmentary reports were reviewed by counterintelligence teams looking for clues about technical evacuation networks or the dispersion of classified documentation. As inspections progressed, it was found that certain technical groups had managed to leave the country before the total collapse. Some engineers crossed borders with false identities or through logistical routes used by other regime personnel. There were records of presence in industrial regions of South America, where they joined local companies or remained inactive. Intelligence services maintained indirect monitoring of several of them, without taking formal action in most cases. Meanwhile, in Nuremberg, the legal dismantling of the Reich's institutional apparatus began. The trials presented evidence showing how the regime prioritized technical investment over civilian needs, channeling resources into developments that did not meet immediate defensive criteria. Contracts, financing projects, and links between military officials and scientists were analyzed. Some were called to testify as part of the judicial reconstruction of the regime's operational model. Internally, the impact of these revelations created tension. The civilian population faced material devastation while details of state-funded technologies were made public. In several localities, occupation authorities promoted the destruction of symbols, files, or documents that could link local companies or technicians with special programs. In this context, attempts were made to redefine the relationship between technical knowledge and political responsibility. In 1947, the Western powers adjusted their policies regarding the handling of German intellectual property. The transfer of patents, industrial designs, and manufacturing processes to government entities was made official. Some designs were incorporated into national laboratories under confidential agreements. Others were commercialized through private companies with specific legal restrictions. In parallel, technical centers were created where industrial processes found in occupied territory were replicated. These institutions operated with mixed personnel and under the direct supervision of state agencies. In the Soviet bloc, access to German technologies was integrated into structural plans. Technicians, tools, and entire facilities were relocated to industrial areas of the USSR. Institutes were created dedicated to adapting recovered systems, many derived from research initiated before the collapse of the Reich. Although the achievements were presented as national advances, internal documents reflected a strong dependence on German materials and technical schemes. In 1948, the start of the Cold War caused a change in the management of these resources. In the United States, several files from the paperclip program were sealed, and the names of participants were removed from public records. In the Soviet Union, the same was done under different structures. Any mention of prior collaborations with German scientists was restricted. Official versions attributed all progress to internal efforts. Scientists who were captured or transferred to the Soviet Union were assigned to projects aimed at continuing the development of advanced weapons. Under Soviet direction, these teams achieved remarkable progress, and with the incorporation of German specialists, they reached their first nuclear success in 1949, making the USSR the second atomic power on the planet, just behind the United States. Part of this achievement was directly due to scientific knowledge obtained from the former German program. Similarly, the civilian use of nuclear energy was born as an extension of its military applications. During the 1950s, enormous resources were invested to transform atomic energy into a controlled electric source. In 1954, the Soviets built the world's first operational nuclear power plant in Obninsk. The Western powers responded quickly. The United Kingdom and the United States launched their own plants in the following years, marking the beginning of a new technological era. The submarine war, in turn, represented another decisive field in post-war military development. In the military field, the Germans had also achieved a considerable advantage over their adversaries in submarine development. The Type 21 model, the latest innovation of their fleet, barely participated in combat as it entered service during the final months of the conflict. However, at the end of the war, many of these vessels were captured and incorporated into the navies of the victorious powers. These submarines represented a technological revolution. They could remain submerged for longer periods, move faster underwater, reload their torpedoes quickly, and provide better living conditions for the crew. Their features were so advanced that the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and Sweden used their design as a reference to develop the next generation of submarines, marking the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. But not all of the German scientific legacy was related to engineering or technology. There was a deeply dark side, the medical experiments conducted by the Nazi regime. During the war, German doctors subjected prisoners in concentration camps to atrocious tests, exposure to chemical weapons, deadly viruses, and extreme conditions such as hypothermia. In most cases, the test subjects died or were executed after the experiments. These practices lacked any moral or scientific foundation and were harshly condemned when they came to light after the war. Nevertheless, some of the data obtained, such as the effects of chemical agents or low temperatures on the human body, were later used in medical research. Even today, there is a profound ethical debate about whether it is legitimate to use information that originated from such atrocities. For this reason, in the armed conflicts of the following decades, the political allies of the great powers ended up facing each other with weapons and vehicles derived directly from German technology. This was clearly reflected in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, where much of the armament came from or was inspired by the advances achieved by the scientists and manufacturers of the Third Reich. The equipment captured at the end of the war was distributed among the Allied countries and their satellite governments during the years of the Cold War. Thus, in the battles of that period, opposing factions could be seen using weapons of common origin. The MG-42 machine gun, famous for its rate of fire, or the Sturmgewehr 44, STG-44 assault rifle, considered the first modern automatic rifle. The latter served as a direct basis for the design of the AK-47, the most produced and widespread weapon on the planet, symbol of countless conflicts of the 20th century. However, not all military material was reused. The transfer of tanks, planes, or armored vehicles from Europe to the United States was so costly that in many cases it was not worthwhile. If the equipment did not outperform American models or offered no scientific value for study, it was chosen to be discarded into the ocean rather than risk it falling into enemy hands. This practice spread among the Allied armies, although the United States applied it the most. After the war, the surplus military material was handled in various ways. On the island of Espiritu Santo, Vanuatu, where the Americans stored large amounts of equipment, it was decided to abandon heavy machinery there: bulldozers, trucks, cranes, jeeps, and even tanks. The military offered to sell it to the local French administration for $6 per unit, but the French administration tried to wait for the Americans to leave in order to obtain it for free. Upon learning this, the Americans preferred to throw everything into the sea rather than leave it unpaid. For days, they transported the material to a coastal point and sank it, even detonating some to ensure that no one could recover anything. Hence the popular name $1 Million Point. Many captured vessels suffered a similar fate, deliberately sunk or used as targets in tests. The Allies used some ships for weapons testing, including nuclear explosions, to study hull resistance and the behavior of materials under massive detonations. Tons of military equipment, from small arms and vehicles to chemical arsenals like mustard gas, were thrown into the ocean. Much of this legacy remains underwater, with the environmental risks that entails. In parallel, from 1944, the Nazi regime began hiding large amounts of weaponry in underground depots throughout Europe. The operation was part of the so-called werewolf. The idea was that if Allied or Soviet forces occupied German territory, clandestine cells would unearth these caches to organize resistance, carry out sabotage, and complicate the occupation. Although there were some attacks and scattered actions, the movement never coordinated effectively and posed no strategic threat after the surrender. Nevertheless, the Allies and Soviets knew about these hideouts and dedicated resources to locate them. Many were found and their weapons confiscated, but even today depots occasionally appear during construction or exploration, and hundreds remain undiscovered. In short, much of the Second World War weaponry was deliberately destroyed, sunk, or used in tests, while another portion was buried with the intention of maintaining future resistance. Many items reappeared in later conflicts. German weapons and designs influenced equipment used in Korea and Vietnam, and a significant fraction still remains hidden underground or on the seafloor. Some treasure hunters dedicate their lives to deliberately locating these hidden Nazi weapon depots, considered true time capsules. Many do so to donate the finds to museums or simply to add them to their private collections. Thanks to the terrain, clayey, compact, and with low moisture, much of these objects is preserved in astonishing condition, as if the war had ended just a few days ago. Among the findings are weapons, helmets, uniforms, insignias, documents, ammunition, and personal equipment, offering a direct window into European wartime history. However, a large amount of military material, from both the Axis and the Allies, was abandoned in areas where recovery was impossible or uneconomical. In the deserts of Libya and the Sahara, for example, hundreds of tanks, planes, and trucks still remain in places known as war cemeteries. The extreme heat and dry air have allowed many of these vehicles to remain in good condition, becoming silent witnesses of the battles fought there more than 70 years ago. Something similar happened on the Eastern Front, in the Russian steppes. During the rainy seasons, the roads turned into a sea of mud, forcing soldiers to abandon stuck vehicles that were inevitably buried. After the war ended, no one bothered to recover them, and today they remain immobile under the mud of what was the Soviet Union. Nowadays, there are even tank hunters dedicated to recovering, restoring, or selling parts of these historic armored vehicles, an activity that combines history, commerce, and adventure. In the Soviet republics, where industry was devastated, captured weaponry was also used in another way, melted down and recycled as raw material. The metals from Nazi tanks, cannons, or rifles were reused to rebuild civil infrastructure and manufacture new weapons during the Cold War. Meanwhile, thousands of original pieces, weapons, uniforms, medals, and vehicles were preserved in museums across Europe. Today, these collections serve to educate and remember, showing what the war machinery that shaped the 20th century looked like. In countries such as Germany and Italy, it is also common to see historical reenactments representing the most significant battles of World War II, with the aim of raising awareness and keeping alive the memory of one of humanity's darkest periods.